So you know you're getting old when you have to carry 2 sets of glasses around with you everywhere you go, eh? My eyes are hitting that 50-year-old adjustment, and I find that I need 2 sets of glasses sometimes with different lenses on them. So thanks, Brother Keon. And I always find it challenging down here. There's an Eon, Dion, and Keon, and don't ever test me on those. So thank you to our sisters for a really lovely lunch as well. That was really delicious, and everyone else who helped out with it. So this morning, brothers and sisters, we've been looking at our Psalms, the Psalms, and looking at David's night seasons, which are often our night seasons. And our goals were fourfold: to identify some of the challenges that he faced that were night seasons in his life. That helps us to understand that we're not alone. To number 2, explore and look at some of these challenges a little bit better, to recognize some of the symptoms and the seriousness of these challenges, to be compassionate. In our last class, we looked at the challenge of chaos in David's life, which we all can relate to at different times. Number 3, to look for some night lights or tools or solutions so that we can better overcome these challenges in our life. And then 4, to recognize that what we read in the Psalms is often what is almost always what Jesus experienced in his life. God put Jesus and David together in these experiences to teach them and to bring them closer to him. And so why wouldn't he do that with us? If God doesn't do that with us, we're going to have a hard time understanding who God is and making our way to the kingdom. So that should encourage us and give us some hope. So this morning, this afternoon, I want to take a look at Psalm 102. And Psalm 102 presents to us our next challenge. So Psalm 102, and let's read verse 1 through 5. Psalm 102, verse 1 through 5. And the heading on my psalm says, "A prayer of the afflicted when he is overwhelmed and pours out their complaint before the Lord. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Let my cry come to you. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my trouble. Incline your ear to me in the day that I call. Answer me speedily. For my days are consumed like smoke, and my bones are burned like a hearth. My heart is stricken and withered like grass, so that I forget to eat my bread because of the sound of my groaning. My bones cling to my skin. I am like a pelican of the wilderness. I am like an owl of the desert. I lie awake, and I am like a sparrow alone on the housetop." Now just notice in these verses the feelings of the psalmist. The psalmist feels like his life is going up in smoke. His body is wasting away like he's in a fire. It's withering like grass. He's experiencing weight loss. His heart is smitten, he says. He's groaning. He's afflicted. In the Hebrew, that means he's depressed. He forgets to eat his bread. In other words, he's losing track of time and the need to eat and the need to take care of oneself. In verse 9, he's weeping and crying to God. And in verse 1, he just says he's so overwhelmed. And Gesenius defines that word overwhelmed as being completely covered in darkness. Completely covered in darkness. And so here is the psalmist going through a very dark time in his life, and he's crying out to God. Now, the psalm doesn't have an author, but there's a lot of clues that point to Hezekiah. So it may be Hezekiah. There's a lot of details in here that match the experiences that he describes in Isaiah 38, a very dreadful illness that Hezekiah went through. And his life was extended when he pleaded out to God. The Assyrians were at the door of Jerusalem and threatening to take over and destroy the city. So the psalmist, if it's Hezekiah, is in a dark place. And just notice some of the other details that are provided in the psalm. In verse 6 through 8, he describes three different birds: a pelican, an owl, and a sparrow. And he uses those to describe his feelings and his condition. And a pelican in this verse is in the wilderness, but normally pelicans are not in the wilderness. They're out on the water. They form groups. They're gregarious birds. They are friendly with each other. But here it's alone, and it's in parched territory. He describes the desert owl. And if you look up the desert owl is an owl that lives in the cliffs in Israel, down in the desert areas. They are solitary creatures, alone. They're nocturnal. They come out at night. They're up at night, just like the psalmist. And he describes himself as a sparrow. Sparrows, if you watch them, they're very social birds. I have sparrows that come to my bird feeder at home, and they're always playing with each other and chasing each other around, and they form groups. But this sparrow, in this verse, is alone on a housetop, all alone, on its own. And this is how the psalmist feels, like a pelican, a desert owl, and a sparrow. And so it's a really mournful scene that the psalmist has painted here for us. Now, just think about that in terms of your own life. Can you put yourself in the shoes of the psalmist here? Have you ever felt like this pelican or a desert owl or this sparrow on a housetop? And what would you say David is really, or Hezekiah or the psalmist is really dealing with in these verses? How would you describe his feelings? He's lonely, right? This is a man who is dealing with severe loneliness, isolation, feelings of being abandoned in his life. Maybe it's because of Hezekiah's illness. Maybe it's because he's trapped in the city and the Assyrians are threatening to crash down the wall. And these environments and these animals are similes of his loneliness and isolation. And notice in verse 7, he says that, I lie awake. So it's keeping him up at night, like other challenges in his night seasons. Perhaps verse 8, he feels he's all alone because of all of his enemies. He says in verse 8 that he is a reproach. My enemies approach me all day long. Those who deride me swear an oath against me. In verse 2, he says, do not hide your face or incline your ear. He's talking to God. Perhaps he feels that God has turned away from him, doesn't see him. He doesn't feel heard, valued, or viewed by his God. Verse 10, he says, because of your indignation and your wrath, for you have lifted me up and you've cast me away. It's almost like one of those wrestlers that you see on TVs, right? They pick up somebody and they toss him out of the ring. That's how he feels, like he's been tossed out of God's ring. God doesn't care about him anymore. So the psalmist has wrestled with some very serious loneliness and feelings of abandonment in his life. Now, the King James never uses the word loneliness. If you do a search, you can't find it in the Bible. It didn't really appear until the late 1600s in the English language. But the concept is all the way through the Bible, isn't it? You can think of other people who experienced loneliness. Leah, Elijah, Joseph, Jeremiah. Paul says, only Luke is with me. Now come on over to another psalm that was written by David, Psalm 25. So we get a flavor of the loneliness of the psalmist in 102. But take a look at Psalm 25 as well. Psalm 25 and verse 16. This is a psalm of David. Turn yourself to me and have mercy on me, for I am desolate and afflicted. The troubles of my heart have enlarged. Bring me out of my distresses. Now, this word desolate here is actually the word lonely. It's translated lonely. In your translation, you may have, I am lonely and afflicted. Now, difficult to place where this psalm occurred. in David's life, but it would seem that it was while he was running away from Saul. And so here is David in a night season of loneliness and isolation, which causes depression and anguish. Can you relate to that in your own life? Or maybe you know somebody in your family or a brother or a sister in your ecclesia who's lonely, who's isolated and struggling because of that. And loneliness gnaws away at our bones at night, like David says in the Psalms, right? It just eats away at us. It decays us over time. Perhaps, brothers and sisters, if we're in a bad state, we may feel that God has left us alone as well. I know at times I've wondered, what is God doing with my life? Has he just dropped me completely? So it's valuable to stop and to talk a little bit about loneliness, because it's here in the Psalm. It's real. And understand how that can be part of our nightlights. And I'm not an expert on the topic of loneliness, but I'll share what I've read and what I've experienced myself in my own life. So first of all, what is loneliness? Loneliness is the mental or emotional discomfort. It's a feeling that we experience from being or perceiving ourselves to be alone. This distress results when our inherent or God-given needs for intimacy, companionship, and meaningful social connection are not met. That's loneliness. There is a mismatch between our desired and our actual connections and relationships. So that's loneliness in a nutshell, a feeling of discomfort. Now, we could continue with a few more thoughts on loneliness. It's not necessarily a fact. So loneliness is not a fact. It is a state of mind. It is a feeling, as we said, a feeling and emotion that causes people to feel empty, alone, unwanted, disconnected, unloved, not understood, abandoned, untrusting, or on the outskirts of society. You could live alone and crave companionship. But loneliness also describes what you feel when you're in a crowded space and you aren't connecting with people as much as you'd like to be. So what does that mean? Well, it means that just being in a crowd or part of something large doesn't mean that you're not lonely. Even people who are surrounded by others or are in a long-lasting marriage or in a family can still experience very deep and pervasive loneliness in their life. We may even feel lonely here at Bible school, and yet we've got 30, 40, 50 other people that are around us. We may feel lonely in our ecclesia. We may feel lonely in our own family. And obviously, David and Hezekiah, they had family, they had friends, but they still felt lonely in their life. A couple other things to keep in mind with loneliness. So loneliness is not the same as solitude. Sometimes we say that they're the same word, but they're not. Loneliness is marked by feelings of isolation despite wanting social connections. It's often perceived as involuntary. Solitude is voluntary. We choose it. People who enjoy spending time by themselves continue to maintain positive social relationships. And I can speak for myself. I enjoy solitude on my own from time to time. Helps to recharge. I enjoy just that space for my brain. And some people need it more than others, right? Some people are very social and they gain energy by being around people, and other people are a bit more introverted. They gain energy by having some downtime from other people. So that's important to understand. Everybody has their own social or connected balance in their life that they keep. Secondly, there's lots of factors, but overall, feelings of loneliness are tied to social connection. That's the heart of the issue, social connections. There's a researcher from down in the States, Dr. Brene Brown. You may have heard of her. She's got some really interesting research on a lot of interesting topics. But one of her research areas is connection. And she makes some really great observations about loneliness and connection. She says, we are hardwired, and I put in there by God, because he's created us that way, to connect with others It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. And without that connection, we suffer. There's suffering. Connection is the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from that relationship. So a key cause of loneliness is the absence of sufficient, meaningful connection with self or with others. Now, can you relate to that in your own life? Like, if you just stop and reflect on yourself, where do you fit in the scope of loneliness? Do you feel that you have meaningful connections to help you with loneliness? Do you have meaningful connections in the ecclesia, in your life, in your family, with friends? Now, you may think that all this is a little bit fluffy, loneliness, schmoneliness, get over it, suck it up, have a nice stiff upper lip and deal with it, right? Maybe you think we're making an issue out of it, out of the Psalms, but the propensity for loneliness has existed since the beginning of time. In Genesis 2, verse 18, it says, it was not good that man should be alone. And God recognized that. And he provided animals. He provided Eve to help with social connections in their lives. In 2017, and this was just before COVID, there is a man by the name of Vivek Murthy. Ever heard of him? Vivek Murthy? He is the U.S. Surgeon General. He is an intelligent person. He's written a lot of really interesting stuff over the last few years, especially. And he really raised the alarm on the topic of loneliness. And that's what we're trying to do in our class today, is raise awareness of the topic of loneliness in our lives. And he identified loneliness as a public health crisis. And not just that, he identified it as an epidemic worldwide. So here's a little bit more information. So he's, during COVID and after COVID, he summarized the results of his research that he had done before COVID into a book and into a paper that he's provided. They're really interesting to read. I've read both of them. This is what he found in his research. Only 39% of people felt connected to others. Only 39%. Pre-COVID, over 50% of Americans experienced loneliness. It was the highest rates. The highest rates were among adults, young people, and that has changed from being older people now to being young people. Mortality impact of being socially disconnected is similar to that caused by smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. Can you imagine smoking 15 cigarettes a day? That's what loneliness does to us. It kills us. It's greater than with obesity and even physical inactivity. There is a greater risk, 25% plus, of cardiovascular disease, heart disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and premature death when we experience a lot of loneliness in our life. So loneliness is not a fluffy topic. Loneliness is serious, and loneliness affects the population, and it's increasing in our lives. Some of the other stuff that he reveals in his research are very staggering and sad facts on social connectedness over the past 2 decades. So he went back through the research over the past 20 plus years, and here is some of the information that he came up with on connection. Social connection is on a downward trend. So he found that over the past 20 years, 2 decades, social isolation has increased by 24 hours per month. So we spend 24 hours less socially than we did 20 years ago. Household family social engagement, time that we spend with our family, it has decreased by over 5 hours per month over the past 20 years. Companionship, there's been a decrease of 14 hours per month over the past 2 decades. And the number of people in America and in Canada that are living on their own and are not getting married is going up. There's less companionship. Social engagement with friends, a decrease of 20 hours per month. family social engagements, a decrease of 6.5 hours per month. Social engagement with others, a decrease of 10 hours per month. So the trend, brothers and sisters and young people, is down, 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 down over the past 20 years. And that's just a sample. There's a lot of other research that he provides. So loneliness is headed in the wrong direction, and it has for decades. It's not just COVID related. It's not just due to COVID. We are becoming less socially connected. We are using less social supports in our life. And just because we are Christadelphian does not mean that we're immune. This can be a major night season in your life, in my life, in our friends' life. Finally, some of his research strongly correlates persistent loneliness to a host of very serious and negative health effects. We touched on a few of them, but here's a few more. So persistent loneliness activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain. So it's just like if I punched you or you got cut with a knife. It's a stressor. That means that it increases our blood pressure, inflammation in our body, hormones such as cortisol, adrenaline decreases immune function and sleep. So it has a negative impact on our health. 3 times the likelihood of developing dementia and Alzheimer's. It increases both total cancer incidence later in life, worse survival outcomes for cancer. It increases the chance of recurrent stroke or heart attack. It's strongly linked to early death, depression, suicide, forms of mental illness, diabetes, arthritis, and other diseases. Decreased memory, alcohol and drug use, poor decision making, less exercise, higher fat diet, and many of the impacts are interconnected. So in other words, they feed off of one another and they make it a downward spiral in our lives. So you can see loneliness is a serious thing. And that's why the psalmist, his Psalms, describes it as he's losing weight. He feels like his bones have been burned by a hearth. That's what loneliness does. This is a really amazing quote by Mother Teresa years ago. She says, "The most terrible poverty in the world is loneliness and the feeling of being unloved." Do you agree with that? It's true, isn't it? So despite pain that we feel from loneliness, I also believe it's okay to feel lonely. I believe that God has given us the emotion of loneliness partly for our benefit. It's an emotion, and unlike any emotion that we have, what's important is how we respond to that emotion, what we do with that emotion. Loneliness is the body's and God's method of alerting us through pain that we feel that there's a need to change something in our life. It affects our brain. And my therapist that I have back home that I go to says pain is the catalyst for change. Pain is the catalyst for change. So if we are feeling lonely, brothers and sisters, it's time to make some changes in our life. If we have somebody that we know who is lonely, we can help them to make that change and encourage them to make change in their life. So here's some ideas on help for loneliness, and these are from the researchers and the experts. I'll just go through these quickly, but practicing self-care and self-compassion is really important. Looking after ourselves, food, sleep, exercise, embracing solitude. Sometimes it's helpful to go out and to spend time with yourself to recharge and meditate, but not for extended periods. Adopting a pet. There's lots of people back home who now have these therapy dogs and therapy cats. We were in the airport on the way down. This guy had a cat in the airport, and he had it on a leash. It was a help cat for him to help him feel better. So sometimes pets are helpful. Nurturing existing connections and relationships. That means coming out to meeting, going out for a coffee with somebody, breakfast with other brothers or sisters, going to weekends and spending social time, talking to strangers at the store, at the park. I know I practice now. If I'm in the store, I try and smile at people that I go by. In the airport, and if people are walking by my house, I try and smile at them and say hi. And some people think you're a bit weird, but It's helpful. It's helpful. It makes me feel a lot better if I just smile at people. Making new friends. That's hard to do, right? You know, if we aren't willing, as the proverb says, to put ourselves out there to make friends and help friends, it's helpful to, we're going to become lonely. We have to put ourselves out there in order to make those friends and to socialize with people, not on our phones, not necessarily on Zoom, although they can be helpful and they do have their place, in person. Being able to look at someone's face, being able to hold their hand, being able to smile with them across the table in person is so important. Joining a class or a club or a support group, in other words, getting out of the house, volunteer, contributing to something that you believe in, like the ecclesia or something else, giving to or doing something for others. There's some studies that came out of Australia on acts of kindness and how important acts of kindness are in reducing loneliness. So just doing something for somebody else takes the focus of yourself and puts it onto somebody else. Just dropping by something, buying them something, cutting their lawn, picking up the eggs from their chicken hen. I'm not sure. Lots of things you can think of, right, to be creative with. Visiting a therapist, especially for chronic difficulties with loneliness. There's lots of great therapy programs, and I know that there's, this is not always helpful, but it can be very helpful. And lastly, limiting screen time. They've found through research, getting off the computer, getting off the phone, getting off the iPad, turning off the TV and social media is critical, especially with young people. Computer games, screen time has just gone through the roof, but they contribute to loneliness. So putting that away and getting our social connections going is really, really important. And brothers and sisters, a lot of these points that I'm making here, they come from the researchers, but you know who provides them first? They're in our Bibles. The principles and the basis for a lot of these things is in our Bibles. God has said it before anybody else has said it. And I can't stress the last two in here enough. Therapy. I go to a therapist. I've gone through a lot of difficulty in my life in the last few years. There are therapists that are not helpful. There are some therapists who are exceptionally helpful. And there are Christadelphian therapists. I encourage you, brothers and sisters, to find a therapist, a good therapist, if you are dealing with chronic problems in your life, mental health-wise or loneliness. We have an aversion in the Christadelphian community to getting help for broken brains and broken emotions and mental health problems. We use expressions like this: you've got this. Fake it till you make it. I've had people say that to me. Just tough it out. This too will pass. And brothers and sisters, they won't. They won't unless we make changes or we get help or we work with God on these things. So there needs to be a healthy caution in working with therapists, but they can provide some incredible help, guidance, and support, expertise, and skills that we do not have innately in our community. Most of us cannot do some of these things, and they can help us with us. If our body was broken, if we broke a leg, we would go to a doctor, right? And get our leg broken, or if we had cancer. So why wouldn't we do that if we had a broken brain? With caution, we would get help for somebody who has some expertise in that field from. So if you are struggling, or you know somebody who is with chronic loneliness or mental health, I encourage you to find a good specialist. Second, that last one down there, the screen time. So digital devices and forums have drastically changed how we connect and socialize. 1 in 3 US adults over 18 report that they are online almost constantly. They hold these things in their phone, young people do, and we can as well, constantly. And despite some of the benefits, it's driving disconnection in a lot of circumstances. So this week at our Bible camp, I encourage you to put your phones away, put them down, and spend time with each other. The most important person you can spend time with this week is right in front of you. I absolutely love the sign that you guys have on the wall over there. God may be calling you but probably not on your cell phone. So put it away while you were here. That's amazing. So those are some general important ways to cope and combat loneliness. But I want to go back to the Psalms, because let's see how David and the psalmist dealt with their loneliness. And I don't believe that the Psalms always spell everything out into nice, organized lists. They sometimes give us core principles to work on. There are clues that we are given that we are expected to search out and to build on creatively in our life. Many of these in the PowerPoints are in the Psalms and are built off of God's core principles, but we have to tease them out. So let's go back. Let's go to one of them, Psalm 25. Psalm 25, verse 15 and 16. How does David deal with some of his loneliness? Verse 15, my eyes are ever toward the Lord, for he shall pluck my feet out of the net. Turn yourself to me and have mercy on me, for I am desolate and afflicted. Now, David doesn't tell us exactly in this verse how to combat loneliness, but he gives us the principle that God has given. And it's wrapped up in that word desolate or lonely. In the Hebrew, it means to be alone or solitary. So David is saying he feels alone and solitary. Now, it's an interesting word that he uses here in the Hebrew. It's typically translated in our Bibles as fatherless a number of times. And that word is used by David because loneliness leaves us feeling like we are fatherless or motherless or friendless or orphaned from others. He has used that word very specifically because of the background in that word. It's an awful, helpless feeling. But in using that particular word for fatherless, he is reminding us of some very key Old Testament principles regarding the fatherless. I think he's cluing us into that. And these principles about the fatherless or the lonely are some of the solutions that we can use in our night seasons of loneliness. Come over to Psalm 146. Psalm 146, verse 8 and 9. Notice what's said here by the psalmist. Psalm 146, verse 8 and 9. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord raises those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the strangers. He relieves the fatherless and the widow. The way of the wicked he turns upside down. So here is God stating very clearly, the psalmist is stating that the Lord watches over the strangers. He relieves the pain of the fatherless and the widow. And that's reassuring to us, brothers and sisters. God intimately cares for those who are loneliness or feel like they're fatherless or literally are fatherless. If we feel alone in our life, God sees that and he is watching over us and he knows that we are going through that experience. And David knew this. He's reminding himself of principles from the Old Testament. God cares for the lonely, for the fatherless. Come on over to Psalm 68. Another reassuring verse for us if we feel lonely. Psalm 68, verse 5 and 6. This is a Psalm of David, verse 5. A father of the fatherless. That's the same word in the Hebrew as lonely. A father of the lonely, a defender of widows is God in his holy habitation. God sets the solitary in families. He brings out those who are bound into prosperity, but the rebellious dwell in a dry land. So he plucks us like pelicans out of a dry, parched land of rebellious people. He unchains us. He relocates us if we feel that loneliness, that fatherlessness. So that's very reassuring. Now the question is, how does God do that? How does God practically and tangibly help us with that? Well, when we look up that word fatherless, again, some of the Old Testament principles should ring bells for us and help us to answer that question. So if you come back to Deuteronomy 16, we run into, we may feel like this bird in a net sometimes. If we come back to Deuteronomy 16, and verse 14, what does God say about the fatherless or the lonely? Deuteronomy 16 and verse 14. He says, you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter and your male servant and your female servant and the Levite, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates. That's the same word. It's the same combination of the strangers, the fatherless, and the widow, which is a big theme in the Old Testament. It's repeated 18 times in Deuteronomy. The stranger, the fatherless, the widow. The stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. You should take care of them. In other words, in these verses, to be invited and included in the feast, and this is the Feast of Tabernacle here in these verses, they were to be invited to them, and they were to be invited to participate in those feasts. And the key in those verses is verse 11. It says, you shall rejoice. In other words, they weren't just supposed to be invited to the feasts of Israel. They were to actually have a good time and enjoy it and be glad that they were there and be able to participate and share in that, like people who did have families, who weren't lonely, who had mothers and fathers, who weren't orphans. And so God deeply cared for the lonely, and he wanted them to have connection. He wanted all of us to have connection, even if it was a feast. And a large part of the responsibility to watch over and to set in families, as the psalmist said, fell on Israel. And therefore that responsibility falls on you and I as well. God uses us to accomplish that, setting in families, making sure that others rejoice at the feast. It's very easy for us as an ecclesia to sideline or to forget or to not proactively look for and include those people who are lonely in our ecclesial events or in our family gatherings, whatever we may do. Verse 12, why did God want them to do this? You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you should be careful to observe these statutes, because they were all bondmen at one point. In other words, we have all been rescued from being lonely and vulnerable and orphaned at some time in our life. So when David expresses himself as being desolate in the Psalms, or lonely or fatherless, he's causing us to go back to the Old Testament and remember some of the principles that for looking after the lonely, and principles also for ourselves. So brothers and sisters, ask ourselves, do we do that? Do we proactively reach out to others to connect in our ecclesia? Sometimes it takes some gentle persistence to get together with other people, doesn't it? We have to keep trying and trying, and it may be awkward getting together with others who are going through difficult, lonely periods in their life, but God wants us to reach out to people who are in those situations. And not only that, the flip side of the coin is, if we are lonely, if we're feeling loneliness in our life, then we need to encourage ourselves to show up at the feast, to get ourselves out of the house, to turn off the TV, to turn off our phones, and to participate and socially connect with other people. That means coming to meeting and not, as the Brother Dev said, sitting on Zoom all the time. It means going to our study weekends, our CYCs, our Bible schools. It means calling people up and getting together with them. So if we are lonely, we need to take action. Pain is the catalyst for change in our life. If we are feeling lonely, we need to make changes. Now, a number of years ago, the University of California, Los Angeles, they created what was called a loneliness exercise. And that's what you guys did. In between the classes, you filled out the UCLA loneliness exercise version 3. And it's very interesting at measuring the levels of loneliness in people and in society. So I want to just show you the results of what you guys filled out. And nobody's names, obviously. But this is the results of what you handed in. So the scoring on this, they have a scoring. So if you had a score of 34, you have low loneliness. If you had a score of 35 to 55, you have moderate to moderately high loneliness. If you had a score of over 55, you had high loneliness. Okay, so in our group here today, the average score was 44. 44, right sort of in the middle. So 97.5% of us had moderate loneliness on our sheets. We're regarded as having moderate loneliness. 1% had high loneliness. 1.5% had low loneliness. Now, you may look at that and say, well, hey, that's pretty good. I don't think it is. If we are a group of people who are taking care of each other and looking after our loneliness and socially connected and connected to our God, why are we all sitting in moderate loneliness? It means that we deal with loneliness on a regular basis. Do you know what the American average is? Is their score? 44, exactly the same as what you guys scored today. So we have in our Christadelphian community the same level of loneliness as the general population outside of our ecclesia. Brothers and sisters, that tells me we got work to do. We can do better. We can work at our loneliness, and we need to support each other in our loneliness a lot more. Now, you may think, well, this is an anomaly, but this is from a Bible school back in February. The average score at that one was 42, almost exactly the same. 70% were in the moderate. There was more in the low and more in the high, but very similar. We score the same as the general population, non-Christadelphians. So practically, brothers and sisters, one of the keys, I think, to our class today is let's think about ways we can reduce loneliness for ourselves and for our brothers and sisters. Come up with an action plan. Write down a couple people in your mind that you're going to look out to this week, and you're going to call up, or you're going to try and get together with and spend time with them, or encourage them to come out to meeting or to spend time. One of the things that the U.S. Surgeon General notes is that this level of loneliness is growing larger because of a baby boom generation. So more people are getting older, and the older groups of people, as well as the younger groups, are getting lonelier. They're on their own more. There's more baby boomers that are on their own. He also notes that there's a growing population of strangers, especially in Western countries. We have immigration into Canada like we have never had before. Canada is a small country, and we're growing by over 1 million people every year, and our population was only 35 million a few years ago. And they're all immigrants from other countries. The other year, I was kayaking, boating beside this park in downtown Toronto, and it was absolutely packed. But I couldn't see a white person in the park at all. It was all people who had moved over from other countries like India and Africa, and they were getting out and socializing like they do at home and like we don't do in North America. There's a brother in our ecclesia who's moved over from Nigeria, and he was saying to mom just the other week, it's really hard socially because nobody gets together, especially in the winter, right? Everybody lives at home and stays at home. So loneliness is real. It was real for David. It's real for us. We've got to deal with it. It's an epidemic, and we can deal with it. God has given us some clues on how to help each other. So there were times when God literally set David himself in families. Can you think of a time? David says God sets the lonely in families, and he did it to David. Come on over to 1 Samuel 22. God helped David with loneliness as well. 1 Samuel 22. 1 Samuel 22, verse 1 and 2. And this is a great story. I love this story. There's not a whole lot said about it, but it speaks volumes as to a very important event in David's life. 1 Samuel 22, verse 1 and 2. David is running from Saul, and he departs from there and escapes to the cave of Adullam. You think that was kind of a lonely experience, right? When his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became a captain over them. And there were 400 men with him, 400 men in this cave. So here is God setting the lonely David into a family of 400 men who were struggling as well and dealing with issues in their life. And you can imagine some of them must have been lonely as well, depressed, bitter men who came together under a common cause and created safety from their own enemies. I would have loved to have been a fly in that cave. There would have been some great experiences in there. And his family comes down and visits him and all these people. So God provided this cave to help David out of his loneliness and to help others who were lonely as well. And they would have cooked meals together, sharpened their swords together, traded stories over the campfire at night, sung psalms together, wrote psalms together. If we are feeling lonely, brothers and sisters, or we know someone, we need to look for a connection cave. It doesn't have to be 400 other people. It can just be one or two. Create a connection cave, a quality group of friends or friends that we can get together, and it could be in doing many things together. In his book, Vivek Murthy talks about man sheds. So somebody in Australia came up with this concept of a man shed. It was actually a wife who had a husband who was sitting around doing nothing. And she created this cave. She had a shed built in her backyard. She bought all kinds of tools, put the tools in the shed, and said, go out to the cave, go out to the shed in the backyard, and just build something. And he did. And you know what happened? One of his neighbors came over and started building with him. Before you knew it, there was 15 other men that would get together every single day. They would have coffee, and they would build stuff together. Brethren work and connect socially, shoulder to shoulder. Sisters and females connect face to face over a table. So find a way to connect. Maybe it's a sister's weekend, a brother's weekend. Maybe it's having a man shed in your backyard to connect. That's what David did. That's where God took him. Now just note that some of these people in this cave with David, they were in similar circumstances to David. They were lonely and distressed and struggling to find God. And they shared their experiences together. I don't think it was just a pity party in that cave. It was a building up time. And I know that, brothers and sisters, because in the next chapter, it says that there were 600 people in the cave. So the numbers kept growing. There was a good party that was going on in that cave. It was a great place to be. Everybody was coming to it. But this is what God gives us night seasons and loneliness for, is so that we can share that and our experiences with others, especially when we come out of that loneliness. Come on over to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 makes this principle clear to us. 2 Corinthians 1, verse 3 and 4. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our tribulations, in our night seasons. Why? That we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ. So the key, brothers and sisters, is God allows us to go through loneliness and night seasons, and he comforts us so that we can learn to comfort others and console others. Do we see the experiences and troubles that we go through in our life as opportunities to learn so that we can help others with their troubles as well? Paul says that that's why God gives us difficulties and why God comforts us, so that we can share that with others. We have a responsibility to do that for others. It's not just a choice. We need to do that for one another. Notice this word comfort as well. It's an important word. He uses it several times in these verses, comfort and comforteth, 5 times. It's the Greek word parakaleo or paraklesis. Para means beside. Kaleo means to call. In other words, it means to call, to come alongside. So we are comforting by calling someone else to come alongside, whether it's God or whether it's a brother or sister. And the purpose of that calling alongside is to comfort and to support. So this word actually makes a really good object lesson. I do quite a bit of kayaking back home. And last year I took a course with a bunch of people up in Northern Ontario. And one of the skills that we had to learn, I had to sort of laugh, was it was called coming alongside. And you'd think, what does that mean with kayaking? But in kayaking, it's very important to understand and to know and to have skills how to get your kayak parallel to somebody else so that you can help them, so you can talk to them if there's bad weather. If they're sick, you can be with them or to give them something, whatever it may be. And sometimes in rough weather, you need to tie your boats together to ride out the storm, right? So we had to pass in this course the skill of coming alongside. And I'll tell you, it's very easy as you're coming alongside to start yelling at somebody or to take your paddle and accidentally clip them across the head or to tip over their boat, right? It's a skill. And it's the same thing with ourselves in the ecclesia. Parakaleo, coming alongside, is a skill. Are we skillful at it? We're not very skillful at it, are we? We quite often clip somebody on the head as we're trying to support them, right? Or we say something to them that's not very helpful. Or we do something to them or talk behind their back or whatever. We're not skilled at comforters or coming alongside. And quite often, as we learned in the kayaking, it's not about doing anything really. It's just being there, sitting beside them, listening to their story, listening to their pain, understanding, trying to understand what they're going through, and just saying, I'm here for you. I can hear that you're going through a really difficult time. If there's something I can do, I want to help you with it. Not necessarily giving them advice, not yelling at them, not telling them what to do, not judging their situation, just coming alongside. Brothers and sisters, there's a skill that we can take away from in our class today. Come alongside. And another solution, brothers and sisters, Psalm 25, verse 14. And this is important. This goes back to our what we talked about with connection. Proverbs 25 and verse 14. Or Psalm 25, verse 14, sorry. Psalm 25, verse 14. The secret of the Lord is with those who fear him, and he will show them his covenant. The secret of the Lord is with those who fear him. He will show him his covenant. What does that mean? Especially that word secret. The secret of the Lord. And the Hebrew in this context means intimate counsel, conversation with God, connecting intimately with God. In the ESV, it translates it, the friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him. And that's the Hebrew agrees with that translation. In other words, David realizes that God wants us to build a very close friendship connection with him. And that connection provides intimacy in our life, friendship, closeness that we may not get from anybody else. We may not even get it from our own spouse or our own kids. And this helps with loneliness. So David shares encouragement to develop an intimate connection with God. And he shows how he develops this connection with God all the way through the Psalms, doesn't he? He's very connected with God. Are we connected with God? Do we spend time every day connecting with our best source of friendship and help in this life? Look at the context of these verses and just think about who David is reminding us of in this context here. Psalm 25, verse 4. So These verses surround his comment here about creating a connection with God. Psalm 25, verse 4, he says, show me your ways, O Lord. Who's that? Who does that remind you of? Verse 6, he says, remember, O Lord, thy tender mercies and thy loving kindness of old. Who does that remind us of? Verse 7, according to thy mercy, for thy goodness' sake. Who does that remind us of? That statement, thy goodness. Verse 9, he says, the meek will he guide. In other words, the humble, the meek will he teach. Who are all those verses drawing our minds back to? Moses. That's Moses. He's referring back to Moses. And who was Moses in terms of connection with God? They're very connected, right? This is a man who knew what connection with God was all about. Take a look at these verses as well. Verse 13. His seed shall inherit the earth. Who does that remind you of? Verse 14. He will show them his covenant. Verse 14. Friendship or counsel of the Lord is with them that fear him. Who does that remind you of? It's Abraham. Those are words that are associated with Abraham, the friend of God, a person who was deeply connected with his God. And so, brothers and sisters, when we are up at night, as I've said, and we may feel lonely, go to the window and look up at the stars and be reminded of God's connection with Abraham and Moses. And those are our role models in creating connection in our life, encouraging other people to create connection with God to combat loneliness. God has given us people to connect with, but I believe God wants us to match that with a deep connection with him. And we do that by prayer, by making him part of our life, by talking to him, by consulting with him, revering him, meditating, loving him, communicating with him all the time, like he was physically right there beside us. Brothers and sisters, several years ago, I used to get up early in the morning and I would go down to this little lake. And I lived down in the U.S. at the time, and I was going through a very difficult time. And I used to sit on this little bench, and I used to do bird watching from this bench. But I noticed that I used to always sit on the end of the bench. I asked myself once, why do I always sit on the end of the bench? Why don't I sit in the middle of the bench? And I realized, as I thought about it, it was because I was always talking to somebody beside me, and it was God. I was having these conversations with God beside me, and I could visualize him on the bench beside me, listening to what I was saying, hearing what I was saying, and helping me through these difficulties. So, brothers and sisters, make space on a bench for God to sit beside you so you can talk to him and intimately hold his hand, because he hears you. He's right beside you. He wants to hear you, and he wants that connection with you deeply. There was a brother in Europe a couple years ago who said to me, Nate, there are times when God takes out all the scaffolding around us when we go through our trials, and he leaves us hanging in midair with nothing to grab onto except God's hand. And when we are lonely, do we reach out and take God's hand? When we are laying on our bed at night and we're deeply lonely, do we reach out and just practice it physically? You don't have to imagine it. Do it. Reach out and say, God, I need you to take my hand. And brothers and sisters, I do that now. I reach out in my nights, and I'll reach out and I'll say, God, take my hand. Don't let go. And I've got your hand as well. And believe that he has your hand. Maybe that image, making it real in our life, helps us to realize how close God is to us. In fact, you know what? God encourages us to do that. Come on over to Isaiah 41. This is a great verse. Isaiah 41. Isaiah 41, verse 8. He's talking to Israel. But you, Israel, Isaiah 41, verse 8, you, Israel, are my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the descendants of Abraham, my friend. So we just read about. Verse 13, I, the Lord your God, will hold your right hand, saying to you, fear not, I will help you. And brothers and sisters, God is telling the offspring of Abraham who we are, the friend of God, who we are, to hold onto his hand, to seize onto his hand. Now, brothers and sisters, those are some of the night lights that David used to deal with loneliness in his life. Creating connection, reaching out to other people, being reminded that God cares about the lonely and the fatherless. Connection is at the heart of dealing with our loneliness, and connection with God is truly important. Now, just to close, come on back to Psalm 22. Psalm 22, verse 1. Psalm 22, verse 1. We started with this in our last class, right? A psalm of David. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? And from the words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night season, and I'm not silent. Who is this, brothers and sisters? David wrote it, but who is it? It's Jesus. This is messianic. So it wasn't just David who felt lonely at times and disconnected from God like we do. Jesus felt that way as well. He experienced these same night seasons as David. Jesus knew what deep loneliness was in his life. Without his family, you remember him in the garden, how isolated he must have felt? Even the disciples had gone to sleep. He's sleeping, they're sleeping, and he's praying. And I'm sure that Jesus could sympathize with the loneliness of David, and therefore he can sympathize with the loneliness we feel. And I believe, brothers and sisters, that God gives us loneliness in part to understand the loneliness that Jesus went through in his life, to understand the depths of despair that he experienced, to know that we are not alone and that he went through those experiences even more so than we did. And although Jesus was a lonely sparrow on a housetop, God valued him. God helped him as that lonely sparrow on the housetop. Matthew 10, Jesus says, do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. Brother Keon alluded to that. And we are more valuable even than sparrows that are alone on the rooftop. So brothers and sisters, as we wrestle with loneliness, may we reach out to the Psalms for our nightlights.